Hello, this is Michael Tracy, and this video is going to look at the numerous attempts the Chinese made on Mount Everest before they finally reached the actual summit in 1975. A common part of the narrative being pushed to support the Chinese having reached the actual summit in 1960 is that they were able to easily duplicate it in 1975. However, left out of the propaganda is that after 1960, the Chinese made attempts in both 64 and 66, getting nowhere near the summit. And even in 1975, their successful summit on May 27th came after two failed attempts earlier in May that resulted in the death of one climber and the double amputation of another. In addition, the 1975 summit route was significantly different from the alleged version of what happened in 1960. In 1975, they started from Mushroom Rock, well above the first step, and the ladder up the second step had already been put in place the day prior. While the photos and film of the Chinese on the summit in 1975 unquestionably confirm that they did reach the actual summit, it is difficult to even call it a Chinese team, as 6 of the 9 were of Tibetan nationality. And that is the phrase the Chinese use, Tibetan nationality, even though China considered Tibet to be part of China, and thus all of them Chinese citizens. So the summit push of the 9 climbers was broken down into 2 parties of 4 and 5 people each. The 4 in the lead party who reached the summit first were all Tibetan and had been born in Tibet when it was not part of China. Unlike the 1960 expedition, which had no water and high camp and took 19 hours to allegedly reach the summit, the 1975 team started above the first step and took just 6.5 hours to reach the summit. And yet, despite spending a full 70 minutes on the summit in 1975 and allegedly finding the bust of Chairman Mao wrapped in the Chinese flag left by the 1960 team, not a single photo or film clip exists of this historic find. Today, both the bust and the flag are located in a museum in Lhasa. So let's break down the 1975 climb. First, much like John Krakauer's version of the 1996 climb, the Chinese version of what happened in 1975 has changed numerous times over the years, especially as it relates to injuries and deaths. Also, like 1996, enough photographs exist of the 1975 expedition that we can reconstruct the climb with a high degree of accuracy. We'll start by looking at how the Chinese keep rewriting history to make the 1960 climb look more like the 1975 climb. To start with, there are the logistics of the expedition, reported in 1988, which has both expeditions having exactly 500 total people, 70 that climbed above North Col and 35 that climbed above 7,600 meters. North Col is about 7,000 meters, and 7,600 meters would correspond roughly to Mallory and Irvin's Camp 5. The first thing that is curious in those numbers, as they were supplied in 1988, is that they are the exact same thing for both 1975 and the 1960 expedition. That is, there's exactly 500 total people, exactly 70 climbed above North Col, and exactly 35 above 7,600 meters. But their initial reports of the 1960 expedition have much smaller numbers, and even today there are no records of so many climbers other than in that 1988 total. The initial Himalayan database for 1960 shows only 23 total climbers, and it is not clear exactly how high each one of those got. They would just be reporting people that went up on the upper mountain. For the few times the 1960 team did get above 7,600 meters, there is no way their small camps could support 35 people. The Chinese account has 13 people reach the final assault camp in 1960, and it is doubtful that there were anywhere close to 35 high-altitude climbers that year. Thus, there's this retconning going on by the Chinese to make the 1960 expedition look more believable, and it doesn't just extend to the number of individuals. The Chinese claim, now this has been thoroughly debunked, that their assault camp in 1975 was much lower than the assault camp in 1960, 8,300 meters for 1960 and 7,790 for 1975. The actual assault camp were at 8,550 meters at the base of the first step in 1960 and 8,650 meters or at Mushroom Rock in 1975. Both expeditions initially reported no deaths or serious injuries, but there was one death in 1960 as well as in 1975, and there were frostbite injuries in both expeditions, one climber on the 1975 expedition having both his legs amputated. Fortunately, as with the 1996 expedition, there are enough photographs of the 75 expedition that we can piece together what really happened without relying too much on Chinese propaganda. We also have an expedition book entitled Another Ascent of the World's Highest Peak, Kumulungma, which was published in Beijing in 1975 in English. It's not clear how so much information got past the censors, but it contains details of the climb that do not appear in any other official account. For instance, it reports the death of Wu Chu Yu, which was published in 1975, and in all the other official accounts, there was no death reported until 1994. In 1994, Elizabeth Hawley published an article in American Alpine Journal stating she had been unaware of this death prior to that time. Thus, perhaps because the 75 publication was in English, somehow it managed to go largely uncensored, so we get a look into what actually took place. The 1975 team started from their high camp next to Mushroom Rock at 8 a.m. Beijing time. This photo is useful for Mallory and Irvin enthusiasts because it shows the ridge on the way over to the second step, and you can see there is no body there. A recurring myth is that the Chinese saw a body in that section, and there was even a team that went out there to look for it. Not surprisingly, they didn't find anything, as you can see that there's nothing in this photo. From Mushroom Rock, they headed over to the second step, where the ladder had already been put in place the day before, and they scaled it fairly quickly. For some unknown reason, none of the 9 climbers wanted to redo the supposed human ladder the Chinese claimed to have used in 1960. Had they filmed such a stunt, it would have greatly increased the credibility of the 1960 claim. Once past the second step, they took numerous photos of the route between the second step and the top of the third step, where, for some unknown reason, all the photographs and description of the route stop until the climbers are again on the summit ridge. Viewers recall that there were multiple different versions of the 1960 climb, with the primary difference being whether they took the direct snow slope up the citadel or the summit traverse to bypass that obstacle. The 1975 expedition also does not tell us which of those 2 routes they took above the third step, nor were they able to document the supposed 1-meter rock that so confounded the 1960 expedition. As this rock has never shown up in any photographs of the route above the third step taken by any other expedition, had the 1975 team been able to document that such a rock did exist and it needed to be scaled, it would have greatly enhanced the credibility of the 1960 team's claim. Once on the final summit ridge above the citadel, the 1975 photographs resume, and numerous photographs exist of them on the summit. Although they had both a still photo camera and a film camera, no photos were taken of the alleged historic find of the bust of Chairman Mao wrapped in the Chinese flag supposedly left by the 1960 team. Looking at what the Chinese told us about their 1975 climb indicates it was far from the easy climb where 9 climbers reached the top on their first try. Instead, it was only after 2 failed attempts, with 1 death and another double amputation, that a team was able to reach the summit. And far more telling is what the 1975 team didn't tell us, namely how the route they took in 1975 remotely matched the supposed detailed route description provided by the 1960 team. The only detail ever provided by the 1960 team was that there was this 1-meter high rock at some point that gave them extreme difficulty. Unfortunately for the Chinese, that rock was apparently no longer there in 1975. Either that, or the Chinese never got that high in 1960 and instead just made up the whole story about the 1-meter rock. But speaking about rocks, the Chinese did collect summit rocks in 1975, and it is only after those rock samples were collected that they published any scientific analysis of the composition of Everest summit rocks.